Chad Channing, in my opinion, does not get the credit he deserves for his major contributions to Nirvana. In this video, I'm going to show you clips from my interviews with producers Steve Fisk and Jack Endino, as well as Sub Pop co-founder Bruce Pavitt, where they talk about Chad Channing and more. How is Chad as a drummer in general? Did you enjoy working with him?
Oh yeah, he's a great drummer and doesn't get his due. Mm-hmm. He's got a looser kind of, I guess, a hippie feel or something like that. But I think he sounded great in Nirvana. I think that version of In Bloom that he did was really, really good. Mm-hmm. Maybe as good as their version with Dave. If you want to just talk about opinions or something like that. But no, I think Chad's an amazing drummer. He's a really good guitar player. He's a songwriter.
Mm-hmm. So. Yeah, I agree. I feel like Chad really doesn't get the due. I feel like he should have been in the Hall of Fame.
When things get that big, there's all kinds of, shoulda, this or that. Everybody means well.
I wasn't that happy with Chad's drum kit. It didn't record that well. I didn't like the sound all that much. There was a little too much hi-hat bleed on some things.
So you mentioned Chad Channing right now. For me, as a Nirvana fan, I always... first of all, I felt bad that he wasn't inducted to the Hall of Fame. I really felt he should have been. Secondly, I feel like he's kind of overlooked because all the credit to Dave Grohl, he's a monster drummer. He's one of the best drummers out there.
How you compete with Dave Grohl?
Exactly,
He's everywhere.
Exactly. But I feel like because you're competing with someone who's like Dave Grohl, he kind of gets overlooked. As a drummer, from your experience working with him, was he a good drummer to work with?
Yeah, he was great. He's artistically a very good drummer. He's got a good pop sense. As Dave Grohl has pointed out repeatedly, he was playing a lot of Chad Channing's drum parts on Nevermind because the band had demoed a lot of that material while Chad was still in the band. And Grohl has given credit where it's due to that because a lot of the drum arrangements, as it were from Chad. I think the time when you can really hear Dave Grohl playing Dave Grohl drum parts is in Utero. Mm-hmm. Scentless Apprentice being the best example. That's there's Dave being Dave, Yeah. It starts with a drum pattern that's completely iconic. So, yeah, Chad doesn't get credit, but Chad, he was not as ambitious as Dave, and nobody plays as hard as Dave. I mean, I don't know how his limbs and joints and muscles can withstand that level of intensity, really, because Chad's a pretty good drummer, but Dave is an animal. So, it's just different people doing different things. Chad has played in a number of other projects years later that I have recorded, actually, where the drumming is marvelous, including some of the songwriting, because Chad is actually a songwriter as well. People don't realize that. He has a couple of albums under the name Before Cars that are pretty nice tunes on those records. He's a pretty good singer. He plays bass well. Yeah, different destinies. What are you going to do?
Yeah, for sure. But, thankfully, from what I've seen, various interviews here and there, it seems that the split with Nirvana was amicable.
More or less. I mean, I think they were just going in different directions. I know Chad wanted to contribute some songwriting, and that wasn't going to happen. It's just, whatever. They were after something else. Mm-hmm. Now, they didn't just end up with Dave Grohl initially. They did a tour with Dan Peters. They called up they called up Dale Crover and did a tour with him. So there was a transitional period in there while they were still trying to decide who was going to be in the band. Mm-hmm. So, and they had to sort of check out these other people, and it's like, okay, Dan, well, he's great, but he's not quite what we're looking for. Okay, Dale, he's great, but he's in the Melvins, and I wish I'd seen that tour where they played. I think it was in 1990 where they did a tour with Dale. It would have been interesting to see Dale.
I think it would have been the latter end of the summer of that year.
Probably before they went in the studio with Dave Grohl.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I don't know if the latter ended. When did they record Nevermind?
They recorded Nevermind in the end of May, early June, 91.
Okay, so yeah, it would have been toward the end of 1990 then, probably. Much later, when the Deluxe Bleach came out many years later, I reminded Sub Pop that they had a complete live show with Chad Channing on drums, recorded at the Pine Street Theater in Portland, and I believe it was from early 1990. And we pulled out the tapes, and I made a mix of that entire show, which is essentially on the double vinyl version of the Bleach reissue. That's the second disc. So sometime in 1990, Chad was still playing with them. And then after that, we'd have to talk about the session that I did with Dan Peters on drums, which was just Sliver, one song. And then I think they did a few shows with Dan Peters. The Motorsports Garage here in Seattle gets mentioned. I was not at the show. And then they did some kind of tour with Dale Crover. Again, I don't know the exact dates. I didn't see those shows. And then he joined the band and they recorded Nevermind.
This is an open-ended question. Of all the songs you've recorded with Nirvana, was there any one in particular that you were most satisfied with how it came out, the recording?
Floyd the Barber, probably.
Really?
Yeah.
And if I may ask why?
The drum sound. I wasn't that happy with Chad's drum kit. Dale, on the other hand, had a very, very good drum kit, and he knew how to tune it and play it. I mean, he was an exemplary drummer. Now, Chad is a pretty damn good drummer himself, but Dale is one of the top drummers in the world, in my estimation. And I mean, he's up there. He's a monument. And even in 1988, Dale was an amazing drummer with a very good sounding kit, and he knew how to tune it. So the thing is, if you're recording on 8 tracks, you only have a few channels to use for the drums. So you can't rely on technical trickery to make the drums sound good. You have to get the sound at the source. It has to be a good sounding kit played in a well-balanced manner. And that is what I had with the songs with Dale, is, just 5 or 6 microphones submixed onto 3 or 4 channels. Sounded great because he was a good drummer and he had a very, very good sounding drum kit. So that made my recording sound a lot better than an 8-track recording, because it sounded like I had recorded the drums with some full multi-track, array of microphones and technology, and it was really just a great sounding kit. The drums make a lot of difference. So from a technical angle, I like the way Floyd the Barber and Paper Cuts sound. Also the fact that I was allowed to remix those specifically for the Bleach record, rather than using the original rough mixes we had made on January 23rd, which is what went on the Incesticide record, was those original mixes that took about 10 minutes each. Floyd the Barber was originally part of those sessions, as was Paper Cuts, but those 2 songs are not on Incesticide. They were on Bleach from the get-go, but I was allowed to mix them more deliberately because it was part of the Bleach sessions. Like, at the time we were doing Bleach, I think they actually did a version of Floyd the Barber with Chad and decided not to use it because we all, even Chad, we agreed, like, no, we can't beat the version with Dale Crover on it. Let's just use that one. And Paper Cuts, I don't know if they ever even played that with Chad. They didn't try and record that. They just said, now we'll just use the Dale version of that one too. So I had a chance, and I'm pretty sure that Kurt added a backing vocal to Paper Cuts during the Bleach sessions. There's a harmony on it, yeah. And so then I, mixed it again from there. So those were, as we were doing Bleach, the plan was to borrow those 2 songs. Now, Beeswax got added later. It didn't get remixed. It's just the straight-up mix from January 23rd, as far as I remember. It might be a different mix than the one that's on Incesticide. You'd have to compare them side by side in order to tell. And since they were mastered at different times by different people, who knows? Plus one is probably from a backup safety copy and one probably isn't. Who knows about that either? I don't know.
What was Chad Channing like? He's such an important member of that band, but unfortunately he gets overlooked sometimes. What was he like to work with?
He was a little bit like Kurt. He was both Kurt and Chad were very soft-spoken, okay? Sensitive, soft-spoken, creative types, for sure. Chris Novoselic was the exact opposite of that, which created kind of an interesting dynamic. If you were backstage, Chris was the one who was bouncing up and down on the couch, and both Chad and Kurt were way more laid back. So, ultimately it didn't work out for Chad, but he's a really sweet guy and super nice. One of the nicest guys you'll ever meet. And he and Kurt, I thought, complemented each other very well as personalities. That was my take.
Yeah, and often, obviously Dave Grohl is one of the most, famous drummers in rock and roll history, right? He's one of the best ones out there. But I also feel like Chad is still a good drummer. I just feel like he gets totally overshadowed because of the Dave thing. You know what I mean? I feel bad for the guy a little bit.
Yeah, I agree. And Chad, I'm just going to scale back a little bit. And you had asked me, hey, when did you really feel that Nirvana was turning around? Initially we heard him, it wasn't with Chad. I think they're so. I remember the first show that Chad played, there was definitely a marked difference. A year later, a year after that kind of debut in spring of 88, which would be like spring of 89, they released Bleach at this huge showcase that we set up, Tad, Nirvana, Mudhoney, in Seattle. Bleach came out. By that time, their shows were really coming together. And if you check out any of the in-store shows or Google any of the shows from that period on, you're going to see them really come together. And Chad had a lot to do with that. I will say that.
One thing you said that stuck out to me is that Chad and Kurt had similar personalities.
Yeah, yes. If you walked into a room and there were two quiet guys in the corner, it would be Chad and Kurt. Kurt was, let's straight up, Kurt was a genius. Kurt was a genius, so he was a very creative person. He had more of a sense of humor. So if you had a conversation with him, it was always interesting. It was philosophical. He was a deep thinker. He was funny, but he was soft-spoken, and so was Chad. And that's kind of what I'm getting at, is they were both somewhat gentle personalities off stage. Kurt could really flip a switch when he got on stage, for sure.
One of the things that's been very interesting for me over the past few years, having had the chance to speak to people like yourself and others who actually knew Nirvana on a personal level, is getting to hear that inside story of the band. So again, having known Nirvana personally, having known Kurt personally, how do you feel about the image of Kurt that's out there, that he's this bigger than life person?
That's rock and roll. That's they used to throw the term rock god around because that's how society would relate to people who could rock a coliseum. And I just think music does not have the same cultural impact as it did 25, 30 years ago. And my belief is that young people are so distracted with social media that music, like going home and listening to a whole album and really feeling it, young people have less and less time for that. They're too easily distracted. So I can't think of, this is one of the reasons why we keep circling back to Nirvana and Cobain, because at that time they had such a huge cultural impact, because Kurt was extremely talented and extremely outspoken, and really, I think it's been harder and harder for somebody to kind of step in and do that, in part because music isn't as central to people's lives as it was at that time. If you spend two hours a day on Facebook, that's 2 hours less than you're spending listening to music.
Yeah, it's definitely a different landscape now. And so with that said, do you think it's possible for there to be a new underground band like Nirvana that could possibly go super viral, and not just go viral, but hold that popularity long term?
I'm just going to say it's just going to be a lot more difficult for... certainly there's popular artists out there that have millions and millions of Instagram followers and so forth. So I do think there are some artists out there who can kind of command that level of respect and attention, but there's not a lot because, again, people are so distracted. And the rock culture is weaker now than it used to be. That's pretty obvious. You look at the charts, what's popular. I mean, rock and roll, rock music, guitar music still exists, but it's culturally it's not in the ascendancy.
Do you think it could ever get back up there?
It could. Yes, it could, and there have been some moments, in the 21st century. I look at like a group like the White Stripes, for example, who are just like, wow, they're just a brilliant group, but I think Jack White was is probably as brilliant as Kurt Cobain, but they didn't have the traction that Nirvana did.
In terms of Nirvana's traction, Nirvana, of course, was the focal point of an entire movement. They were the focal point of the grunge explosion. And one of the key places in terms of the history of grunge is, of course, Olympia. I was recently in Olympia for a bit, and when I was there, it did strike me very much as a college town, so it's not surprising to me that a city like Olympia, which has a lot of creative, youthful energy, was one of the key places in terms of grunge's development. In your opinion, do you feel that Olympia's youthfulness contributed to the development of grunge?
Yeah, if you really want to get to the roots of it, I came of age in the punk era of the late 70s in Chicago. I came out to Olympia in 1979 to attend Evergreen State College. And thankfully, Evergreen had one of the most unique radio stations in the country. The station was called Chaos Radio, and it featured and promoted independent music. So that's where I got my schooling on indie music and how I was able to kind of initiate the Sub Pop project, which turned into the Sub Pop Records Corporation and so forth. So in a nutshell, Olympia had quite a history of independent thinkers, and I believe that Kurt really fed off that. In particular, there was a gentleman there by the name of Calvin Johnson, who I've mentioned previously, who I worked with at Chaos, who had started his own label, K Records. He was a singer in this group called Beat Happening. And Kurt was so enamored with Calvin that he tattooed the K Records logo on his arm, just to give you a feel for that. So I think Kurt really fed off the college energy of the town. Punks and indie music people in the town really influenced Kurt.